So I'm Nairi Woods, and I'm Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government, and a huge welcome to you all to what is rather a family event. By the way, everyone's greeting each other. The people at the back, if you can sort of squish along a bit on the seats at the back so that a few more people can sit down, that would be lovely. So introduce yourself to your neighbor and cozy up to them a bit, and you'll make some space. That will make it even more of a family event. And then we can accommodate everybody. Paul, as always, is far too popular. Look, it really is a delight to see so many people in this school this evening, former students of Paul's, people who were students with Paul, and so many people who have been affected and inspired by Paul's work. I first met Paul over 3 decades ago in the hallways of Harvard, where he had just arrived to teach in the Harvard Kennedy School, and I had just arrived to teach in the Harvard Department of Government. For those of you who don't know Harvard, there's a lot of distance between those two things. But we were both adapting to Harvard and thinking about Oxford, both of us having come there from Oxford. And it began a friendship which was very formative to the founding of the Blavatnik School of Government. When I first decided that I wanted to build a School of Government at Oxford, the first dozen or so senior academics were all categoric in their advice. They said, don't waste your time. Lots of other people have tried. It won't work. Don't waste your time. And then on one sunny day, I sat with Paul Collier at a little table on Broad Street, having a coffee, and I said, Paul, this is what I want to do. I know it sounds silly. I know everyone's telling me not to do it, but what do you think? And Paul was the first one to say, go for it. And not only did he say go for it, but he said, I'll back it 100%. And that's exactly what he did, and came and was one of the founding faculty of the Blavatnik School of Government. And over the years, I've come to see two Pauls that all of you have interacted with at least one of. And I'd just like to say a word about that. But the first thing that stands out about Paul as a friend and as a colleague is his values and his aspiration. An aspiration not just for him personally, but for his students and for governments and for countries and communities across the world. As you all know, and I'm sure will be repeated tonight, the son of parents in Sheffield who left school when they were 12. It seems to me to give Paul not just a sense of purpose and a sense of aspiration, but a fine-tuned understanding of some of the obstacles and barriers in the way, and a real skepticism and challenge about the way most other academics define and write about those challenges. For Paul, it's about empowerment, it's about opportunity, it's never about charity and preaching. It's about working with governments, not on governments. It comes with an empathy of how difficult it is to govern. And I think Paul, of a time early on in the school where we were hosting a minister of mining from a country who had received an absolutely dizzying amount of advice from a dizzying number of international organizations. And Paul just sat there and said, yes, but here are actually the two things you need to focus on, Minister. And you could almost hear the academic footnotes as he said these two things, with people saying, oh no, but he's wrong, but he's not this caveat and that caveat, and he's not looking at this data set. But by clarifying, by simplifying, by saying to this minister, here are the two things you need to worry about, he was empowering her and giving her some clear direction. Paul's love of the classroom, his sheer joy at standing and engaging with students, unstoppable, and it's felt by the students. Every year that Paul has been here in this school since its founding, students have just crowded into his option to be part of it. And of course, they don't just get the teaching. They get the care, the attention, the help getting a job afterwards, the advice of Pauline, the dinner in the family home when they're upset. It's the whole package, his values and aspiration. And then I just wanted to say a word about Paul's challenge. Paul is iconoclastic in the very deepest sense of the term. He's chosen since his doctorate not to sit refining theories in the library, but always to challenge them, as I see it, along two different axes. First, empirically. So that work, that early work that said, okay, this is what all the theories are telling us about East Africa, but what if we actually went and got real data about these countries? What would we then find out about them? And it's the policymakers in those countries, in Tanzania, who remember this very white, very red-headed, very young man in sandals and shorts, traipsing from one agency to the next, gathering the information he felt he needed to have to understand what was going on. But also, theoretically, Paul has always comes at economics with an aspiration to make it better, richer, more aligned with the human experience and with human possibilities. And over the 30 years, I've seen Paul engage with political scientists, with behavioral scientists, with sociologists, anthropologists, always with a fresh idea to bring to an analysis that starts in economics and invariably ends up in something more eclectic. I remember the Bottom Billion Conference, Paul, before you wrote the book. Extraordinary range of disciplines, all in the room together, arguing, and Paul drawing sense, practical sense out of it in that magnificent book. But of course, with that sense of iconoclastic challenge comes real challenge. And when I remember when Paul, when you first joined the school, academics saying to me, "Really? You can cope with Paul?" And what's interesting to me is that the government leaders around the world would not understand that because they see an empathetic Paul who helps clarify, who helps direct, who is empathetic to what they're doing. The academics in the room see a different Paul, which is a sharp, challenging Paul. I recall him sitting at the front of this room when colleagues had been, instructing students on how to be respectful of each other. And then Paul piped up, "If you want a safe space, go to kindergarten." And there was a sort of stunned silence. The challenge was there. Even more robust, and I will never forget this, Paul, was your private response to an errant professor, where you brought to bear in a private communication a deep sense of your values, of what it was right to do, with a deep analysis of why in that situation it was the right thing. And it was one of the most powerful communications of values and behavior that I have read as an academic. So Paul, thank you for believing that Oxford could build a school of government and then helping every step along the way make this a place for people, for students, for governments, for thinkers from all different disciplines to come here and have conversations. It's been fantastic, and it will remain fantastic having you in our community. So I'd like to, sorry, I've gone on a bit long, and it's going to be my job later to make sure others don't, so apologies for that. But Paul is now going to say a few words, and then I will welcome to the stage the first panel. Paul.
Well, thanks very much, Nari. Thanks for proposing this and hosting it all. But I really want to thank especially the team of talented and committed people working out of the limelight, who've taken this from a dreamy sort of what-if idea to an accomplished voila, and they know who they are, but thank you very much. Some people have come a long way to be here, and I think it's, I would like to just recognize His Excellency Mamadou Bawumia, who's come all the way from Ghana, Rafat, who's come all the way from Cairo, Anke, who's come all the way from Germany. All of them, at one time or other, my brilliant students. And I'm so proud that we've stayed in touch enough that they want to come here and made a big effort. Since this is a celebration of my career, I suppose I have to say something about myself, which doesn't sound like a weepy Oscar winner. So my working life has been driven by a series of passions rooted in uncomfortable contrasts, and I'll just sketch 3 of them. My early work was on Africa, a series of books and articles that eventually got distilled into the bottom billion. And for the last 50 years, that work on Africa has been driven by one uncomfortable image that literally I saw 50 years ago. I was flying to Tanzania, and at those days, you changed planes in Nairobi, and I was sufficiently muddled up, hard to believe, isn't it, Jane? But I was sufficiently muddled up that I missed the connection. And so I got put on a little puddle plane, a little rackety old thing that hopped down the coast, one little stop to another. And I remember getting out at an airstrip on a little island called Pemba. Now it's a tourist resort, but in those days it was just an airstrip. And very few foreigners ever went there. But there I was, and I remember this local youth, must have been about 15, 16, staring at me, looking at me. And I looked back at him. And I remember thinking, why are my life chances? There I was at 16, and here I already am, a successful academic in Oxford. And what are his life chances? What are your life chances are zilch. And then I asked myself 2 questions. Why are your life chances so much worse than mine? What can be done about it? And then a 3rd question, what can I do about it? And that, what can I do about it, I came up with an answer, which I keep coming up with the same answer, which is bring in the academic cavalry. A team of academics who can do all the research, often much, much better than I can. And so a few years after bringing in the cavalry to work on Africa, I founded the Center for the Study of African Economies, now run by Stefan, wherever he is. And then I worked with Anke on the African Economic Research Consortium to try and build up a stock of African academics. And about 20 years ago, I founded the African Central Bank Governors Roundtable, which for many years was kindly hosted by John Vickers at All Souls. Fantastic. And that's continued. Stefan now runs it. So that was my Africa work. Next one, more recent, much more recently, I've been working on regional divergence within England between booming London and its satellites like Oxford and many depressed provincial cities and towns, And that's again, a really uncomfortable contrast between the chances of people growing up in London or Oxford and the chances of people left behind in these now desolate provincial cities. And because I grew up in Sheffield, then a thriving city of steelmakers, I'm very conscious of that. Despite my parents not having any education worth speaking of, they were comfortably off, a pork butcher and a shop assistant. They were doing all right in Sheffield at that time. And like many northern kids, I passed the 11 plus, went to a grammar school, and the grammar school got me here. So my life chances were, even in those days, were not too bad. But those life chances have diverged massively since, massively. Sheffield is now the poorest city in England. And that's awful. And the tragedy is it's avoidable. So what can we do about it? Well, do the research, read up, then write a couple of writable books, and that became, those just as the Africa stuff had eventually got distilled into the bottom billion, these two much more recent ones got distilled into the future of capitalism and left behind. And then I brought in the academic cavalry, and I remember a team of 8 of us. Tony, you were there, you remember? We were there in the office, the personal office of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And a team of 8 of us, and we were all there explaining to Treasury officials why the divergence of provincial cities like Sheffield from London and Oxford was, first of all, disastrous, but secondly, avoidable. And that by changing policies, they could actually renew poor places. Not return them to their past, but renew them. So that's what we tried to do. Well, we failed, but at least we tried. And then currently I'm still working with Sheffield and South Yorkshire local government and with local universities. I'm delighted that somewhere in the audience tonight is Sir Chris Husbands, the former Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University, which was a magnificent place in his day. When you enter Sheffield and you see all the buildings, the new buildings, all of them have been put up by Sheffield Hallam. And that's such a fantastic achievement. But did we succeed in any of that? Not really yet. We're still trying. And then finally, these two streams, the left behind places in Britain and Africa, fused into a third strand, which was left behind cities like Sheffield around in reasonably prosperous countries. And just to focus minds, I'll give you the example of Latin America. And Latin America, deeply polarized set of countries. For some reason, my Left Behind and the Future of Capitalism sell better in Latin America than anywhere else. And it's because I'm sort of really trying to bring people together in the center, and a large group of centrists feel very neglected by the extremes of left and extremes of right. I work, I'll give you an example, we've only time for one example. Barranquilla. Barranquilla is a city on the north coast of Colombia, and it used to be a really thriving city. It's always been a multicultural city. Those of you under the age of 30 will probably have heard of Shakira. Those of you over won't, right? But Shakira is from Barranquilla. She's a poor kid from Barranquilla and is now the best-selling singer in the world with a foundation to help poor kids in Barranquilla. I got brought into Barranquilla. I'm going back for about the 5th time in the summer because Barranquilla, just like Sheffield, spiraled down. Now, why did it spiral down? Partly it's an economic process. Investment flows out of these places, not into them, contrary to Milton Friedman. But it's more than that. It's a psychological process. Because what happened in Sheffield and in Barranquilla, and happens again and again, is that people start to blame. They're looking, why are we falling behind and others are not? And they either blame some minority group that they can vilify, or they blame each other. The workers blame the firms blame the local government, and the local government blames both the firms and the people. Right? And that psychological spiral down is hard to reverse, but it can be reversed. That's what I'm at the moment trying to do in a left-behind place in Scunthorpe, and in Sheffield, trying to bring people together. The hardest step is to reimagine a future that is not just returning to the past. In Barranquilla, whilst I was there once, I did rather a powerful speech, I suppose, which was criticizing the National Development Fund, which is their sort of British business bank, but bigger. And I criticized it for not being overly centralized and failing to help regions that were falling behind, like Barranquilla. And to my astonishment, that criticism of the National Development Fund got back to the National Development Fund, and the head of the National Development Fund invited me to come to Bogota and tell him and his team what were they doing wrong. And literally, he assembled 200 people like this and said, these are the top 200 people around here. You tell me what I'm doing wrong. And I did. The astonishing thing is that they listened and they changed the bank's policy. Colombia's National Development Fund is now much more devolved and dedicated to helping left-behind regions. So it proved easier to influence Colombia, despite not speaking Spanish, than it had proved trying to influence the British government. Now, let me turn very finally to what you're going to hear tonight. And I am going to hand over in a moment. I should say, my long-suffering team, Jane, always knows that I'm occasionally mischievous and inject a little bit of chaos into things. So I'm switching the order of the panels from the thing you've got, which lays out panel 1 and panel 2. So they're still going to exist as panels, but panel 2 is now panel 1, and conversely, panel 1, you've guessed it, is panel 2. So now I'm going to start with applying economics to people in communities. And I'm going to invite Charles Gottfried to come up and chair this panel. And as he's speaking, I'll just introduce people for a moment. Hilary Cotton. Hilary Cotton, you're going to start this off. Do come and sit down. Hilary has the great virtue of not really being an economist.
So obviously I'm totally intimidated statement to be in this room, but it's going to be fine.
What she knows is how the lifestyle and death style of the poorest people in the poorest communities. And she works with them, for them, very closely. And so she will sketch out, she's done 2 brilliant books, Radical Help, which is how we got to know each other, and more recently, The Work We Need. And so she will sketch out what's wrong at the moment. And the challenge for the next 3 of you, who are all great economists, is to say what economics can offer to put things right. So Philip McCann, one of the finest economic geographers in the country, indeed in Europe, and you'll speak second. Dennis Snower, world-famous Dennis Snower, who will speak about the importance of communities. And finally, Colin Mayer, wherever he is, here he comes, who will say what could be the solutions feasible for Britain now to renew its poorest places. And on that note, I leave it to you, Charles. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. We have 45 minutes for this session, and what we're going to do is we're going to hear from each of the 4 speakers who are going to speak for 10 minutes each, and then we're going to go into questions from the floor. So with no further ado, Hilary.
Thank you very much. I have slides. I'm not sure how, I don't know how I'm going to be able to move them on. Is that going to be possible? Otherwise, we can just start with the first and stick on the first slide. So it's obviously, thank you so much. Now here we are. Right, we can stay here if we feel happy here. But it's an immense honour to be here. Thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me to celebrate you. I didn't realise, I thought it was just going to be a big party. I'm not so in tune with the idea that you're retiring, but anyway, thank you. So Paul has made an impact in so many ways, and obviously we're going to hear about those this evening. But for me, one of the most important is the writing of serious books that you can read on the beach, starting with the bottom billion. Because ideas can kill us or they can make us soar. And I think in the telling of compelling and unflinching stories about how power works, Paul has done so much to inspire those of us everywhere who aspire to be change makers. And so in homage to Paul, I want to tell you 2 stories this evening. They've been chosen by Paul, actually, and like all favourite tales, the first might be familiar to some of you. So as Paul said, my work is about social systems and how we can transform them in ways that would enable each and every one of us to flourish. And like Paul, I started my career in Africa, and in the 1990s I came back to Britain and I started to work on the welfare state, which is how I came to be standing one sort of rainy day, rather like this one, outside a front door of a council estate in Swindon. And I kind of ducked under into the kind of the tiny porch outside the front door, and there was kind of like thumping bass coming out and the barking of dogs, and there was a policeman standing there, and I think always in these occasions it's best to kind of act innocent, so I kind of said to him, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And he said, well, look, this family, they cause a lot of problems, especially the son. He's an arsonist and the daughter's not in school. They're out of control. The neighbours complain. I have to come and say what I've got to say. And I said, oh, and then what happens? And he said, well, how they take the message really is immaterial. My job is to come and deliver the message, and then I leave. And a mother, who I call Ella in Radical Help, lived in this house. And when I met her that day, there were 73 professionals working out of 20 departments, each involved in one way or another with her, her partners, and her children, each delivering messages and commands in this extremely expensive game of pass the parcel. And a visionary leader of Swindon Council who knew my work said, could you come and help us reform our social services? And I said, well, I'll have a go. Can you introduce me to some families that you have successfully helped? And it turned out that there weren't any of those families, so I had to change tack and say, okay, well, could you introduce me, please, to the most problematic families you've got? Why don't we start there? And that's how I came to be at Ella's door. And over the course of the next months, with my team, we moved on to the housing estate where Ella lived, which meant that we were there when children went missing after dark. We were there looking for the kind of ready meal on the kind of when they went down in price at the end of the day. We were there when the policemen came, the social workers came, the truancy officers came, the bailiffs came, the shark loans came, and so on. We were in the houses. And when I met Ella, she was in her 30s. She'd never had a job. She'd never lived a kind of stable life of any type. She'd kind of ricocheted from one crisis to another. And so one of the first things we did with her was we built this map of interventions of social services in her life. And this is the map which actually wraps around 3 walls of the room. And you can see that it starts quite low. You know, when she's young, there's not so many interventions, but they build up. We did exactly the same with her son, Alex, the one the policeman was complaining about. This is just 12 months in his life. And then we invited everybody who was making these interventions into the room to see the map on the wall. And there was a moment of absolute shock, because obviously when you work in social services, if you're a social worker or a policeman or whatever, you police person, I should probably say, you don't go into these services to, you know, deliver messages really. You want to make change. But our welfare state is a really brutal place to work on the front line. And so what happens is that you either burn out and you leave, or you numb out and you don't really see what's going on. So we asked everybody who worked with these families to step back. And then we asked Ella and some of the other mothers if they'd like to interview a team who could work with them. And it was, you know, quite a story, which I don't have time to tell. But the first person they chose was actually another policeman. And it was really obvious from the beginning. They didn't want any soft touch. They just wanted people who were human, who would stick with it, who would be real support. And so together we inverted traditional ways of working, and we asked families if they would lead the change. And we asked them what steps would they like to make first. What would they really need to make change possible? And actually change was quite dramatic. Children went back into school quite early on, and then the kind of deep work started of really beginning to kind of do what was needed to live a good life, a flourishing life in the family and in the community. And I described this work and the system impacts and the dramatic cost savings in my book, Radical Help. And I hoped, you know, to emulate Paul, I suppose, and also write a book that could be written on the beach. And I have a mainstream publisher, and I wanted to show how we could create a welfare state that shifts from this expensive management to one that supports the growth of capability. And this is a very difficult concept, capabilities, my publisher said to me. She was really doubtful that any reader in Britain or the US could actually grapple with these ideas rooted in, you know, the work of Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, Aristotle before them. And I pushed back because Ella had understood these ideas perfectly well. And in fact, the families helped us hone our capability metrics that we used for monitoring and evaluation. And this inversion from managing problems to growing capability had been the idea that allowed families to believe in themselves, to make the change, to contribute, to dare to hope, and then eventually to soar. Now, when our welfare states were invented, there was a presumption that families, a bit like Paul described, would be able to stand on their own feet and shape their community's destiny, just as Ella learnt to do. Our social systems were founded on a presumption of good work, and this is the second story I want to quickly share with you this evening. So, of course, help might be needed from time to time, and you would need to invest in education and health, but really there was this idea that a good job would underpin a stable and self-sufficient life. So what happens when the possibility of good work slips away, which has happened in so many places, as Paul just described? And this is the story of my second book, The Work We Need. And in 2019, I started a journey across Britain and then went across the United States to those places that Paul has written about so powerfully in the book Left Behind. And given the failure of orthodox economics to really bring any change to these places, just as Paul describes, I wanted to ask people themselves what they think good work looks like now, and most importantly, how they could organise to be part of generative new local economies. And my journey started in Kilmarnock, which some of you may know, it was once a very wealthy place of lace making, carpet weaving, mining, of course the home of the eponymous Johnny Walker from Johnny Walker Whiskies. But the mining left long ago, and in 2012 Diageo closed the last bottling plant in Kilmarnock and the last of the good jobs went. So I met with a small team of municipal workers, park keepers, drivers of gritter lorries, grave diggers, and I was starting to kind of test a set of visual tools that I had developed to kind of have this latest round of creative conversations. So I made everybody a cup of tea, and I told them what I thought we should do. And immediately, Johnny on the left, this is not a picture of this, but he jumped to his feet and he started to draw on the tablecloth, and he drew what he called a non-linear life. And this idea was about deeply reimagining time and work, not just a 4-day working week, which of course he would have thought was nice to have, but actually a much deeper imagining of the way that work and life can be unbundled and reintegrated. Because the current, school, work, retire life doesn't work for somebody like Johnny, whose labour is backbreaking and he can only do it for so long. And one of the astonishing statistics that I didn't know but I discovered in writing this book is only 30% of Britons reach retirement age still in work. And as I talk about in the book, the reasons for these are very complex, but one of them is that work is so unbearable. The nature of work is a critical factor. And it was at a table, Johnny's colleagues, they joined in, and then suddenly one of them, Arthur, said, are we just dreaming? And they were like, in a cartoon where you kind of imagine all these ideas, and then you suddenly look down and you see that the ground beneath you is gone and you're sort of pedaling on thin air. But they had these really interesting ideas. And when I started the work, I hadn't been worried whether communities would have creative ideas. I knew that they would. But what really startled me was that in these hundreds of journeys I did, working with people all across different geographies and with really different walks of life, is people shared a same core set of basic ideas they want to see happen that don't really engage with policy. They're tangential, but we don't really see them in policy. So these are about having the basics, earning a decent living, having work with purpose, work that has esteem in the community. People want to rethink time and the relationship with care, and play, which was an idea that I never would have thought of would be so important. And they want to organise in place, understanding that orthodox investment policies don't land good work for local people. So these ideas and the human concepts of work and the common fate was striking because in every instance, every idea in the book is doable and actually somewhere is already happening. And so they offer something that Paul writes about that is so important, what he calls credible hope. And yet none of these ideas have credence within orthodox approaches to local regeneration or traditional economic policy making. And Paul and I collaborated on the piece of work that he mentioned in Sheffield, and that's how I met many people in the room, including Philip here beside me. And as Paul mentioned, he's very proudly from that city, and it's also actually, coincidentally, the city that my grandparents are from. And for those of you who don't know it, it's a city built on a confluence of 5 rivers. It's a place of flows. And I want to say, in closing, that I think flow is a quality that deeply characterises Paul and the importance of his work. In the connections he makes between all of us here this evening, between the worlds of social and economic policy, between really diverse disciplines, but also in the galvanizing of ideas. Because Paul tells us, look again at places, institutions, and ideas that have become, in some way, stagnant. And he urges us to create new currents, to make serious change from the beach to the barrier. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Hilary. Philip.
My name is Philip McCann. I am at the Alliance Manchester Business School, and I work as part of the Productivity Institute. Actually, Tony over here was our research director, and Tony and I shared an office for several years. My connection with Paul actually came out of a conversation with Tony when we had the Productivity Insights Network. I don't know if you remember it, but I saw Paul on Newsnight. I'd been living out of the UK for 14 years. I was still very new back into the UK system. I saw Paul on, I'd used several of Paul's books in my graduate courses in the Netherlands, so I knew a great deal about Paul's ideas. I'd never met Paul, and I saw Paul on Newsnight having a conversation, and I said to Tony, I agree with Paul, but there's some things I don't think he said that were correct. And Tony said, tell him, because he will want to know that. So I wrote to Paul, and I took advice from Tony how to, and I wrote a very long email to Paul saying, I'm sorry you don't know me, I've been out of the country for years, but actually there is a lot of evidence, because Paul was saying we don't know about this, and no one's done anything like that. I wrote an email, I said, actually, we do know a lot about it, it just hasn't really surfaced in the political economy debates, including in the media and so on. And Paul immediately set up a meeting with Tony, said, come down to Oxford, come down here to the Blavatnik School. And that's my connection with Paul started. And it's been a fantastic journey ever since. So one of the things that Paul does is really important, is bringing people into the tent, as you said. And whenever I've spoken to somebody who I've said, Paul, I think we need to speak to this person, Paul says, let's get them in, bring them in. Either on a Teams meeting or physically, bring people in and get those conversations going. And many of these people come from different arenas. So the work that I lead on primarily at the Blavatnik Institute is all about people's faith and confidence in places. How do you get investors interested again? So that's the connection with Paul. So we do two big things. One of them is we do a lot of engagement with places which are really hard nuts to crack. Rochdale, Walsall, Great Yarmouth, Newport, South Shields, these places. The places which are completely forgotten. South Yorkshire. They're square pegs in a round hole. They don't fit in any of the governance systems which it comes out of Whitehall. I mean, we follow Andy a great deal with this. How do they do things? They know they've got these enormous challenges, and the tools they've got are simply wrongly designed. They're either insufficient or they're wrongly designed for the problem. And this is a feature of many, many different parts of the UK. So we do a lot of engagement, and we have a big team, including a lot of qualitative work as well as quantitative work, where we have what's called a data lab at the Productivity Institute that builds data, synthesizes data. We work with ONS and lots of other partners to try to help these places tell the stories about themselves. Because data at local and regional levels in the UK historically has been hopeless. And I've worked for 20 years with OECD and the European Commission. We've been miles behind. Why? Because we haven't seen it as being an issue. It's not important. Now we know how important this stuff is. So we're playing catch up. We are doing pretty well, I would say, in the UK in that catch up process, but there's still a long way to go. I think at the Productivity Institute, we're one of those teams who are trying to push that. As part of that work, we work with different institutions. So one of the things that through Paul we've been able to do is team up with people who are outside the academic world. People like Charles Aldington. Lord Charles Aldington was chairman of Deutsche Bank. Ron Emerson set up the British Business Bank. I had dinner last night with Sir Terry Leahy. These are people who think very seriously about these things. And again, through Paul, we bring these kind of people into the tent. Jesse Norman's here, I can see. Politicians, ministers of all political persuasions, it doesn't matter. People who are seriously interested in these things, to try to get conversations that span different arenas. So it goes beyond a textbook into something which is practical. And of course, Tim is here, and Andy. These are all people we've talked to on many, many occasions. Kate Barker, Jim O'Neill, people like that. So in terms of the research work, one of the things that we have done that we think is one of the most profound things we've found. We have a team. Colin is part of that team. Michiel Dams in Groningen. Paolo Veneri from the OECD, Richard Barkham from CBRE. We have worked out the risk pricing of every city and every region year by year in the UK. And we've done it for the United States, and we've done it for all of Europe. And we have a series of papers coming out. We have a paper come out very recently, a couple of weeks ago, in fiscal studies. We had one recently in the Journal of Economic Geography, one in regional studies. And Andy's been fantastic helping us, Kate Barker, Catherine Mann. What do we see happen? One of the issues, if you go back to the early 2000s, around kind of 2002, 2003, under Blair and Brown, there was a big push of rebuilding the cities. So down in Liverpool, you see the Liverpool One programme. You see the Arndale programme in Manchester. You see the rebuilding, the reconnecting of the centre of Birmingham, trying to get those cities back on their feet again after 20, 25 years of adverse economic shocks. You know, the river frontage at Newcastle. There was the State of the Cities report under Michael Parkinson that was commissioned under Prescott, but actually it was Michael Heseltine's idea originally to push these things, to get those ideas. And of course, Heseltine and the politicians didn't realise, Heseltine And the Labour Party at the time, under Prescott, were in constant conversations, even when they were in opposition, to make sure that those agendas continued. So you start to see the green shoots in the cities, but those green shoots were wiped out by the global financial crisis. What we show happened is that narrowing of the risk premium, investors were sanguine about all parts of the UK in the early 2000s, and the global financial crisis led to a flight to safety. And in the United States, that flight to safety was to about 26, 27, the biggest cities, which are the richest cities, except Detroit. Investors knew what they were doing. In the UK, it was to one city, and it was to London and a close hinterland that spread out as far as Oxford, Cambridge, Guildford, Reading, and the rest of the UK was left behind. And those yield spreads, the risk spreads, which were tiny in the UK, widened dramatically at an interregional level to over 200 basis points. And the key thing is the cities were hit the worst. Those spreads are still today of the order of 250 to 300 basis points, and they have not narrowed in 17 years. And what does it mean? The UK today is further than being an optimal currency area than either the Eurozone or the non-Euro parts of the UK. No wonder there's very little traction from central government, because these are two different capital markets. And secondly, the ability of policy to influence what happens. You look at what happened with QE, and of course we talked a lot with Andy and people like Kate Barker about this. London followed QE in terms of the yield movement down the yield curve. No effect on anywhere else in the UK. It's like they are in a different world. And what does that mean? The only way is to look for alternative approaches, and we've read a lot of your papers, Martin, on these issues. Think about governance changes, institutional changes, alternative powers, devolved arrangements, and try and think about linking people. The best description of what happened that we've shown econometrically was Andy's. In your 2018 talk, the UK's become a hub, no spokes economy, and that's literally what happened. We can see it in the data. So this has been very powerful because it's given us something that we can talk to people in finance. We can talk to people in the institution because they recognize it straight away. Okay, we've got to think of other mechanisms, other systems, and that's what we're doing. And that's why this big tent approach that Paul has is so critical. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Philip. Dennis.
I'd like to talk about Paul in a different light. These are very important practical applications, and I have had the privilege of engaging with Paul in terms of the mental models, the ideas that drive much of policy and that drive the conversation between academics and policymakers to get things done, often in a very bad way. Paul is unique in the sense that he is able to ask extremely uncomfortable but necessary questions. And I think the last book, Left Behind, really is sort of the thread through his entire work. He asks the question, why are certain people left behind? And what, economically, socially, morally, can we do about it? And that's not the sort of question that academics generally ask. And therefore, his contribution is not just analytical, but it is civic, it is ethical, and it's grounded in a deep concern for community. And in so doing, he has completely distanced himself from the economics profession, which looks at individuals as little atoms making decisions in accordance with their own individual preference set. That is what generates a lot of the policy advice. And in the last book, Left Behind, there's a very clear diagnosis of what happens to societies when they get abandoned, places get abandoned, that used to be well-functioning, viable, self-respecting communities. And so I'd like to address three themes very briefly here. The first is, what is the centrality of community in people's lives, and how can we put this into our mental model and make it actionable in our policy advice? The second is the failure of conventional economics to understand and value community. And the third is the need for a new paradigm, what David Sloan Wilson and I have called the multi-level paradigm, to which Paul's work points very powerfully. But first, why does community matter? And this is something that is obvious to everyone except possibly economists, which is community is a very, very basic human need. It is a psychological need, but it is also evolutionarily adaptive, because Homo sapiens, they aren't particularly fast, they're not particularly smart, but as in the formation of groups and in the sharing of knowledge and in the emotional motivation of each other, they are unparalleled. And what is unparalleled about it is not just that they can form groups, ants can do that and honeybees can do that, but they can form groups flexibly in response to collective challenges. And if you think about where's the difficult stuff in your life, most of the difficult challenges that we face in our lives are collective challenges. And these collective challenges need to be addressed collectively. And some of those challenges are very large: global warming, biodiversity loss, financial crises. And some of them are very small, family dysfunctions and so forth, and need to be handled at different levels. The interesting thing about human beings is that we're capable of performing at many different levels: the family level, local level, religious level, sports communities, nations, civilizations, and so on. Haven't quite managed humanity as a global effort, but we could get there. And our change in attitude to slavery, to sexual orientation, and so on, points to something that is more global. So communities are the places where we as individuals get formed. It forms our identities, it forms our norms and our mutual obligations. It creates the trust that enables us to interact with one another in civilized ways. And the most important thing is it enables us to treat each other in ways that go well beyond enlightened self-interest. And that is completely missing in economics. So Paul shows in many of his work, and most powerfully in The Left Behind, what happens when communities fall apart. Generally, economic decline is not mainly about falling incomes. What it is about is that it is an erosion of collective agency. And now, economists think they know all about agency. There's principal-agent problems and so on. And agents are individuals. Agents are individuals that can do stuff. Our most important sense of agency is collective agency. And some of our most important sources of human flourishing is our participation in collectives. Now, as soon as I start talking about this, people say, oh, well, you must be a member of the Nazi Party. We've had our experiments with collectives, and we need to steer away from them. I think that is really dangerous, because What is missing when we talk about communism and fascism and so on is a sense of agency, individual agency that is freely given, and that is combined with participation in a collective. And most of our identities come from collectives, and our agency is exercised most powerfully. And now when a community collapses, this sense of collective agency goes. And what replaces this is not what economists would say, oh, that's freedom, because now you don't have all these constraints. What replaces it is fragmentation. People can become isolated, they become resentful, vulnerable, politics becomes angry, and instead of constructive. Economic life loses its embeddedness in society. And actually, if you think about economics, what makes people interact economically, it is the social foundation that makes them interact. Economists always say that all potential gains from trade are exploited. Really? I don't see that happening in the Ukraine. I don't see it happening between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and so on and so forth. When the social foundation is missing, then economics goes awry. You can't understand any of economics without first having grasped the social foundations. So why has conventional economists failed to see this? Because of methodological individualism, that you have to understand what an individual does, and everything that aggregates up is simply the sum of what individuals do. And from that perspective, the policy prescriptions are very simple. If a place is declining, then let people move. If a job disappears, then retrain the worker. If a community dissolves, trust the market to reallocate resources so more efficiently elsewhere. Paul has shown with great clarity why this is all wrong. This logic fails because people are not frictionless units of labor. Places are not interchangeable containers of resources, factors of production. And communities cannot be established simply by creating the right price signals. In fact, prices are often inimical to this. Trust is not something that can be created through prices. That exists on a social sphere. I mean, we all know in various aspects of life that as soon as we put a price to it, put a price to sex, it becomes prostitution. You change the meaning of something as you give it. And this sense of community is something that cannot be priced. And as soon as you do, you've lost the community. So therefore, we need a better understanding of prosperity. And therefore, and Paul has set me on sort of a path. Together with David Sloan Wilson and a team of other people, we're building a new paradigm of economics, which is a multi-level paradigm that rests on a very simple insight that is, however, transformative, which is that human behavior and human performance are shaped simultaneously at multiple levels. There are, of course, individuals, there are groups, there are communities, there are organizations, there are societies, and we function in these different levels at the same time. What ties these levels together is the different, understanding that is the difference between creating a polarized society and a cohesive one. So the multi-level paradigm asks a different question from conventional economics. It's not simply what incentives maximize individual outcomes, but what arrangements enable groups to function well economically, socially, morally over time. And that is precisely, I think, the idea that animates Paul's work, and we've just tried to provide a theoretical foundation for it. And because Paul emphasizes the importance of local leadership, of shared narratives, the need for institutions that bind people together to a common purpose. That is okay. So what therefore is important also empirically is to have data, and we've put together a SAGE dashboard. SAGE stands for solidarity, agency, gain, and environmental connectedness. And those things, material gain without solidarity, agency, and an environmental connectedness, do not create true prosperity. And therefore, I think what I'd like to conclude with is just to return to the person that we are honoring here. He has been never content with elegant models that show things. He shows true moral responsibility and treating people as people that are embedded in communities, and this multi-level way of seeing things builds on his work. And so if economics is to meet the challenges of our time, polarization, inequality, ecological stress, we will have to take community seriously at different levels. And Paul has shown why. And therefore, on behalf of all of us, I'd like to say to Paul, thank you. Thank you for showing us very clearly that economies are here to serve societies, and your work has illuminated why. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dennis. Colin.
I first met Paul in 1972. I walked into his room for my first tutorial with him. And what I didn't realize was that it was going to be the first of 53 years of tutorials. In fact, I still send him anything I write, and it still comes back covered in red ink. I've obviously learnt nothing. But I'd like to pay tribute to Paul for the incredible range of policy issues that he's addressed in so many countries around the world. And I want to illustrate that in relation to one aspect that he emphasizes in his most recent book, Left Behind. And that is the commonality of issues that face the developing world and some of the regions of the most developed countries. And in particular, that what marks them out in both cases is a failure to create enough domestic enterprises that can be scaled up to international and national levels. And instead, what we've had is too much dependence, both in, for example, the regions of Britain and in much of Africa, on multinational corporations and foreign direct investments, which are fragile. As illustrated, for example, by the recent pronouncement heralded by the government that it had just signed a multi-billion US tech prosperity deal that would be transformational to Britain, only to have to announce 3 months later that, well, it was being delayed because the political situation had changed. Now that illustrates the degree of vulnerability that countries face, and the fact that much of Africa is still dependent on extractive, in many ways exploitative, resource multinationals is illustrative of the problem, as is the extent to which Britain is so dependent on the types of low-end investments that multinationals make, for example, in energy-consuming data centers. Now, this is very different from what, in the late 17th, early 18th, late 18th, early 19th century made Britain into the workshop of the world during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Britain was built on the back of small and medium-sized enterprises that sprung up all over the country. And then at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, Britain had some of the most iconic companies in the world, such as Cadbury, Fry, Boots, Beecham, Rickett, Coleman, Lloyds, Barclays Bank. Most of them Quaker companies, which had this real sense of how to run an ethical business. And Britain's presence as a manufacturing industry prevailed, in particular in electrical engineering and electronics and in chemical engineering, through the first half of the 20th century, in the face of the rise of a dominant US presence. But in the second half of the 20th century, those industries collapsed, along with coal, iron, and steel, which were basically the reason for the left-behind areas of Britain. Now, what underpins, at least in part, this failure has been something that Philip has just referred to, and that is the remarkable differences that exist within Britain between the costs of raising finance outside of London and the southeast and in London. 200 to 300 basis points is equivalent to the difference between the cost of capital in London and Romania or Chile. It's equivalent to the capital market segmentation that one associates with different countries, with different political systems and different tax and regulatory systems. But this is within a country. And the reason why it's happening is that one thing we know about finance is that place matters. The co-location of providers of finance and users of finance is a determinant of how much finance they get and the terms on which they get that finance. And one of the features of Britain is that it's basically failed to maintain a presence of financial institutions outside of London and the southeast. Now that again, if you look at the history of Britain, it tells you a great deal about the fact that it has not been the case in the past and it needn't be in the future. Because the Industrial Revolution was financed on the basis of local banks all over Britain that created and built those SMEs. They then collapsed, consolidated, moved to London, so that there were only 5 by the beginning of the 20th century left in Britain. But their position was replaced by local stock markets all over Britain. Every town basically had a stock market. And that was the basis on which those iconic companies to which I just referred were able to develop and build themselves into international businesses. But those stock markets in turn consolidated. And in 1974, they consolidated into one stock market, the London stock market, so that by the second half of the 20th century, Britain consisted of 4 clearing banks headquartered in London and 1 stock market headquartered in London. The rest of Britain was simply unconnected. And what made this even worse was that during the course of the 20th century, the investors in British industry switched from being individual shareholders in these local stock markets to, first of all, investing in pension funds and life insurance companies, which grew to holding about 50% of the British equity by value in the 1980s. Those, at least, were British pension funds and life insurance companies with some interest in investing in the regions of Britain. But with Big Bang, that all changed. And instead of those British funds holding British equity, the foreign, in particular US, equity asset managers moved in and now basically control 60% of British equity. So we have a pool of capital in London which basically has no interest in, no knowledge of what goes on outside of London, unconnected to the rest of the country. Now, what's required to address this is to recognize that there is a fundamental problem that so little in the way of a financial infrastructure exists outside of London, the southeast. 50% of business angels are in London. Two-thirds of venture capital firms are in London and the southeast. 50% of equity transactions by number and 70% by value occur in London and the southeast. What we need to have is a recognition that we require a focus of policy on building domestic enterprises that grow into international champions and remain within this country. And to do that, one requires basically what Dennis was talking about in thinking of building ecosystems. Ecosystems that bring together business with financial institutions in those localities, with educational institutions like further education colleges, with universities that spin out companies, and above all, with devolved government that has the authority to take the leadership in building those ecosystems and creating real communities for precisely the sorts of relationships that Hillary was talking about, and having the devolved budgets and ability to raise finance to do that. And there is one final party that is critical to making this happen, and that is development banks. France and Germany both have significant public development banks that are involved in direct lending to companies in those countries and also helping to invest in conjunction with the private sector to build up those local ecosystems. In Britain, we've got one institution called the British Business Bank, which actually behaves much more like a fund of funds, like a portfolio manager, not engaged in directly investing in building British businesses, certainly not involved in building the ecosystems that are required. And what we need going forward is essentially what we did during the 1970s and 80s in creating an institution called the Industrial and Commercial Finance Corporation. The feature of that was it had branches all over the UK that employed people with a real knowledge and understanding, not only about lending, but also how to build businesses that could help and advise and nurture businesses over a long term. We've done it before. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be able to do it again. And this comes to the final point that I want to make, and that is the link with the developing world. Because one of the features that we've observed over the last couple of years is the eradication, basically, of aid. Trump started this by cutting US aid, and strap-for-cashed governments elsewhere in the world, including in Britain, followed suit. And as a consequence, what is needed going forward is not to rely on aid, but to rely on a combination of private capital and public capital working together, in particular through development finance institutions, in building enterprises, domestic enterprises, in developing countries, frontier markets, and furthermore, in emerging markets. And that is the critical insight that comes out of Paul's book in terms of bringing together that linkage and understanding of not only why do some developing countries not thrive and others do, but also why do some regions of developed economies thrive and others don't. What's true of Gateshead and Grimsby has turned out to be as true of Ghana and Gambia. And thank you very much, Paul, for pointing that out.
So we're at our 45 minutes, but Paul anticipated this and has given us permission to go on a little bit longer. So what I propose to do is to get 3 questions from the audience for the panel to pick. And perhaps you might tell us your name before asking the question. So one over there. Could we have... please wave at me so I can see the second and third question.
My name is Abir. I'm lucky to have both Sir and Madam Collier as my mentors, but also both my PhD supervisors also had Sir Paul Collier as their mentors. So there is that. I run 2 organizations. One is called Youth Policy Forum in Bangladesh, where we send young people to left behind communities to listen to their stories and bring them back in the policymaking circle to create a feedback loop between left behind communities and policymakers, which is very elite dominated, right? I think one thing that was missing in the whole inspiring discussion was young people. I think if we are to empower left behind communities, we have to give young people the hope, and they have to make it their purpose to empower left behind communities.
Thank you very much. And there was a question at the back, if you could wave your arm again. And then please someone else wave their arm. And so one at the back and then one in the middle.
My name is Hugh Lee. Do we need to bring back the bank manager?
Do we need to bring back the bank manager? And then the lady in the middle there. If you could just wait for the microphone.
This was extremely bracing and plausible, and I wish more policy people were here to take us on board.
Could we have the microphone over there? Sorry. And if you could tell us your name.
I'm Ruth Chang. I found this bracing and really inspiring. I wonder, so some of the themes are that we need to put resources into local communities, local institutions. We need to create ecosystems that allow those local institutions and businesses to thrive. So we have to understand that against a background of a wonderful new paradigm for economics, understanding problems as being associated with different levels. But I wonder if there's an elephant in the room that none of you really discussed, which is AI, right? There's this juggernaut of trillions of dollars coming. How does that affect this policy prescription?
That's great. So what I'm going to do is go around the panel, and if you just pick the answers, I think it was youth AI and bank managers. Hillary.
Oh, wow. Well, I just want to say that I agree with what you say about young people. I didn't choose to tell a story about that this evening, but a lot of my work is about that. I think it's really important. I think the AI question is really interesting because I have just written a book about the future of work, which is based in this pilgrimage across Britain and across the US, and the stories of workers. And of course, what's happened with that is that most workers themselves are not actually concerned with AI. I think they think this was going to happen to somebody else. But what they are very concerned about is how we actually develop as humans, how we move from kind of this idea of Homo economicus with everything being so rigidly economic to how we develop across multiple dimensions. And so I have this concept of sapiens integra where we kind of grow across these dimensions. And I think that actually this is an incredibly critical idea, fits in probably somewhere in the levels, because we have to kind of have some collective sense of who we are to kind of confront the juggernaut and make that juggernaut work for us, not the other way around. And the story is not over yet. So it links, I think, very particularly strongly to what Dennis was talking about.
Dennis.
I believe that in order to understand AI, we need to understand the fundamental system on which digital governance currently operates, which is that we get lots of free digital services, and in return we give away lots of information about ourselves, usually beneath the threshold of consciousness. And all of that is funded by those people who wish to influence us, whether economically or politically or socially. So it is third-party funded digital barter. That's what it is. And AI is a much more effective tool for sucking all of this information up and then feeding you the information as if it were a good representation of the world out there. It has the potential, therefore, of breaking up all our communities and undermining all the work. In order to break that stranglehold, it is important to get to a system where individual digital citizens are given control over their data individually and collectively, and to do so in a way that furthers their ability to engage in collective action to meet collective challenges. If we get there, then AI will turn into a force for the good. Otherwise, it's curtains.
Thank you. Philip.
I'll just pick up on the excellent point about the youth. The most amazing turnaround story globally of a city in the industrialized world is Pittsburgh. And as part of the work that we've done across our institute with the Blavatnik School, we have a team, Suzanne's up there, Colin, Paul, a broader team. We looked at 8 cities. We looked at Pittsburgh, we looked at Dortmund in Germany, Duisburg in Germany, Leipzig in Germany, Bilbao in Spain, Windsor, Ontario, and Newcastle, New South Wales in Australia. And we did extremely detailed investigations on how did these places turn around? What was the characteristic of them? Each of them, firstly, in their own country, they were all regarded as the basket cases 20, 30 years ago. There is no future for these places. Secondly, we did a lot of documentary evidence, looking at in huge detail at all the history of what they'd done in terms of building institutions, but we also managed to talk to a lot of the key people. And Paul and I had a meeting with Tom Murphy, who was the mayor of Pittsburgh, who led the team in the turnaround. What was their strategy? Former steel, former coal. They had to decontaminate enormous areas of land, which was non-developable. They got no help from the old extractive industries. They used all the powers they could in terms of federal, local, state, anything they could. But how did they do it? The first thing he did was he appointed a team of young people as his senior team. None of them had any connections with any incumbents or the past. The second thing, he said, you decide what the strategy has to be for the future. The reason is the strategy was built around how do we get young people to come back or to stay to want to invest in their futures. So what did they do with all the land reclamation, rehabilitation? They built cycleways. They built housing where cars couldn't go, but people could cycle to work with young kids. You go to kindergartens, you go to schools. That was the starting point. Design places that young families, particularly university graduates, Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh, places like that, would actually think, I would like to maybe start a business. Thirdly, focus on their entrepreneurial opportunities. How do you provide the mentoring systems, the ecosystems, as Colin said, so that they can start to get all the advice in order to start businesses? That was the core of the strategy. Look at the UK today. You take the case of Sheffield at Paul. Paul and a team, including Suzanne or Colin, also Kate Penny in our institute, they did well over 100 interviews in Sheffield. Who does the mentoring in Sheffield? Their answer is nobody, because all the accountancy firms have left. How do you get advice? You have the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre. Let's see, Andy, you've just been made the Chancellor of the University of Sheffield. You know what's going on there. Fantastic technologies. But where did they get the finance? There's no angel investors. There's no venture capital. There's almost no mentoring system, whereas Paul said in Oxford, you literally knock on the house next door and say, where do I get the advice from? Because these people are awash everywhere. These softer things are critical. So how do you build the institutions? One of the cases that Paul came up with, which is incredible, retired former bank managers where are the bank managers? That was the question. In Sheffield, formed a voluntary cooperative to provide free advice to young entrepreneurs because no one else was doing it.
Thank you.
That's the kind of thing to focus on.
And finally, Colin, and forgive me if you could be brief.
I'll be very... Answer to the question, should we bring back the bank manager? The answer is unquestionably yes. They used to be the stalwart of local communities, and people used to go for good advice onto how to treat their finances and build enterprises. If you now try and find your branch, you're doing pretty well. If you try to find your bank manager, well, best of luck. And if you find him or her, they won't be there tomorrow. Now, what has happened in Britain is that there's another bank called Handelsbanken, which is a Swedish bank that follows exactly the opposite principle of recognizing the importance of branches. And as a consequence, it's become one of the fastest growing banks in Britain, and particularly involved in lending to SMEs and developing the growth of companies. Because the motto of the bank is the branch is the bank, and the presence of individuals in localities is important. Just very quickly on the AI question, my answer to the AI question is straightforward. And that is that AI can do remarkable things in terms of processing data and information. There is one thing that AI cannot do well, and hopefully will never do well, and that is to be human. And what it therefore potentially does is to free up the rest of us to do what we should be doing, and that is to provide community and personal relations with others. It's going to be the basis of precisely what we're talking about here in terms of creating these ecosystems, these communities, because people will be freed up to focus on that. And that is what we need to do in terms of thinking about training the people of the future.
Please join me for thanking again for brilliant contribution.
Now, we're going to move on to the next panel, but can I urge you all to stand up, have a stretch, say hi to the person next to you while the panelists take the stage. Just have a bit of a stretch. It's been a while. And if I can invite the panelists to come. Hi. Good. You're right next to me.
John suggested we might stand at the podium, so we might all do that, if that's all right.
Yes, I'm going to be very strict on time.
No, that's right, do. Just cut us off.
Good. Good, I'm going to start with the fact that I've got permission to cut the each off after 10 minutes.
Been too long. Way back. We used that fantastic.
Yes, they just look fresh. Those are fresh. And there's 2 more coming. Okay, if everybody could sit back down. Could I invite you all to sit down? I have unleashed community. Okay, desperate steps. Okay, we're going to move on to the next panel. This panel is called Beyond Economics, and we have 4 very creative innovators on this panel. And they have begged me to hold them very strictly to 10 minutes each. So what can I do but say, of course I will. And so the very first of these creative innovators, and I'll introduce them each just before they leap up to make their remarks, is Andy Haldane, an economist who injected mischief into the Bank of England, turned some ideas around, but also created Pro Bono Economics, a really important organization doing great work. Andy, stage is yours.
Thank you, Nara. We're all going to stand up and use the microphone to avoid the perils of the roving mic. And huge pleasure and privilege to be here. Delighted to see this is billed as a celebration of Paul's work, and of course there's huge amounts to celebrate. Rather than Paul retiring from work, which would be a tragedy, Paul, and you're not allowed, basically. There's too much needs fixing, and you are the man to fix it, including our joint work with John and with Colin and with Paul Johnson. We've covered already the astonishing breadth and depth of Paul's canon of work, enormous in volume and variety. But one common theme that comes through from it, as you all know, golden thread, is its focus on providing practical solutions to improve people's lives, especially those that are most vulnerable and disadvantaged. And in some ways, we're all here to do that, certainly as social scientists, but Paul demonstrates that absolutely par excellence, and by deed as well as by word, which is absolutely crucial. That, of course, Paul, as well as having a complete unwillingness to accept unthinkingly the status quo and received wisdom, which I also hugely applaud. In these troubled times, those two attributes, focusing on what really, really matters and thinking about how you do it in novel ways, could not be more important. Very difficult to overstate its importance. And Paul, for those of us similarly inclined, but somewhat less brilliant, and who've spent their life, in my case, steeped in public policy, not causing mischief largely, but maybe now and again, you've been an absolute beacon of hope and of inspiration, for which I thank you, and I know colleagues in public policy would as well. I wanted to, in my remaining 8 minutes, give or take, to touch upon, build on the previous panel did a fantastic job discussing the spatial aspect of public policy. It's there where Paul and I's paths have crossed most closely. And of course, it is an area here in the UK of conspicuous failure for at least 70 or 80 years. And as best we can tell, those spatial disparities are, if anything, getting a bit worse rather than a bit better. This is plainly still unfinished business. How to fix those problems, Paul's mentioned, others have mentioned. His two books that speak most clearly and authoritatively to this are those on the future of capitalism and Left Behind. What's striking, I find, reading both of those books, when you do read them, it comes across so clearly and so compellingly and so candidly. You ask yourself the question, how could anyone possibly have thought anything any different than that in the past? Are they mad? So let me answer. Sometimes they are mad, yeah. And a voice of sanity and reason and distinction, I think, is just what we need. Paul's twin hypotheses, I would say, around how we fix this problem have been quietly devastating for much of macroeconomics and much of public policy. One of those theses is about the model of growth that we should use when making sense of the world. The workhorse model, the staple model, is a top-down, trickle-down model, or in the UK's case, trickle-up from the southeast. And that model, let me tell you, has very little to recommend it, whether conceptually, empirically, or indeed practically. Water tends not to flow uphill very often or very easily. And the second thesis underpinning Paul's work that flows from that is that any model of economic policy needs not to be centralist and instrumentalist, a decent description of post-war UK economic policy, but rather needs to speak to lifting the lives of everyone, everywhere. So in terms of turning that post-war tide, what do we need? We need that different model that's built from the bottom up, that builds from the strength of people and places, a model where income and wealth percolates up rather than trickling down, and to accompany that with a policy framework which supports and strengthens from the bottom up that percolation, largely by empowering and investing in local actors, not just local government, but local businesses and local civil society working together in partnership. What are the elements of that? They've been touched upon already by some of the previous speakers, but let me just mention one or two. Of course, it requires a wholesale, full-fat decentralization and devolution of powers to local leaders, plural, not singular. This government, previous governments have spoken of a devolution revolution. We have had no such thing. We remain by a margin the most centralized state in the Western world, and that clearly needs to change and needs to change at pace and at scale. Among what needs to change is the vesting of fiscal powers, the ability to raise money, as well as the ability to spend money. Without that, how can a local leader truly serve as master of their own destiny? We need nothing less, nothing short of a rewiring of the machinery of central government. Think of it as the decommissioning of a dangerous, dilapidated, out-of-date nuclear power plant, or the Treasury, as I like to think of it, who have for too long hogged all of the money in its own piggy bank and hogged all of the powers. Unless and until that changes, how else can we unleash the animal spirits of places beyond Westminster and Whitehall? And to the points others have made, we of course need to build, indeed rebuild, a regional institutional ecology that of course includes an empowered and emboldened local government, but as importantly, has the institutions that nurture education and skills from the earliest of years, cradle to grave, that nurture innovation in place and through business, and crucially to provide the financial lubrication, the banks, the investment funds, the development banks, operating in a decentralized fashion in a way that's commonplace elsewhere, but not in this country. I'd like to think that those within government that have read Paul's books, the scales are just beginning to lift from their eyes. We have seen some progress over the last 20 years in doing some of the above, but it is nothing like the scale and muscularity needed to beat back those wide and widening spatial disparities. We know that because they are still widening. We have governments galore of every hue telling us day after day the importance of growth, the importance of lifting living standards. But the truth is, unless and until they embrace wholeheartedly and with a full throat Paul's two central theses, that is all for naught. And that we can ill afford. We can ill afford another generation of disappointment. I don't mean political disappointment. We're all used to that by now. I mean the disappointment felt by the many, many millions of young and old people across large swathes of the UK, for whom this is the first time since the Industrial Revolution that they find themselves poorer than their parents. A breach of the social contract to end all social contracts. Reconstructing, restarting the opportunity escalator for those young people is the only way we invest in people and place in a way that enables us to make good on that national mission. Paul, in this 5 seconds, as in so many other of minutes, Paul, you have, I like flipping the aphorism, right? Where there's a way, there's a will. Paul has shown us the way, and I hope off the back of that, our political leaders and others besides will be able to summon the political will. Thank you, Paul, for all of that. And at a personal level, thank you for all the kindness and friendship you've shown me over the years. This is definitively not retirement, Paul. We need more, we need it now. Thanks all, everyone.
And now I'd like to invite John Kay, known to many of you, founding dean of the State Business School, not just an economist, but a man whose sharp pen you've all read in many columns. John.
Thank you, Larry. And we've got a title for this session, which is Beyond Economics. And I think we've already seen in the session, talks we've had already, the need to go beyond a lot of mainstream economics in talking about less about the individual and more about communities of people and place, and the need to introduce an ethical framework into the way we talk about these things. And that's what I want to elaborate in what I want to say to you this evening. Both Paul and I have had similar careers in the sense that we have been at Oxford a very long time. We learnt and taught economics there. And then we both had experience in the real world, which changed the ways we think in quite important respects. And that brought us together again, and we now have our more or less reserved table in the Giggling Squid across the road here, where we talk about these things. I want to talk about 3 light bulb moments in terms of encountering the real world and rethinking what I believed I knew about economics as a result. The first of these light bulbs was going in and talking to people in business, people in real business, real serious business people, and talking to people at different levels in business, because I learned quite quickly that if you talk simply to people in the C-suite, you've got the public relations guff, which was generated from them and is now written so brilliantly by artificial intelligence, which I'm sure we'll hear more about before we finish even this evening. I realized that these people in these businesses were not maximizing profits. So of course I asked, because this is what one is trained to do as an economist, if they're not maximizing profits, what are they maximizing? And I worried about that for a bit. Was it growth, sales, or whatever? And then I realized most of these people were not actually maximizing anything at all. They were trying to cope with difficulty with a changing and uncertain environment. And that was what helped me start to think about radical uncertainty, the way we knew much less about the world than the models I was describing, the typical economics model in which you have some maximum subject to constraint and you derive optimality conditions from them. These people were simply trying to cope, not to maximize. And that prompted me to start thinking further about the role of models in economics. Because if these people had been maximizing profits, then what exactly does maximizing profits mean? Because businesses have been around for a long time. Well, obviously it has to be the net present value of profits over some fairly lengthy time horizon, a couple of 100 years in the case of some of the businesses we were talking about. That doesn't seem a very practical proposition. But then we don't have to worry about that because we have the efficient market hypothesis and a set of financial models that enable all this to be discounted by the market into the current share price. So that all a firm needs to do is maximize its share price today, and it has maximized its profits over that 200-year time horizon. Well, I have to say, if you believe that, you will believe more or less anything. But then I'm confronted with Michael Jensen's famous statement, I believe there is no other proposition in economics which has more solid empirical evidence supporting it than the efficient market hypothesis, really. Well, I'm not saying one should forget about the efficient market hypothesis. I've never forgotten a conversation I once had with Colin Mayer, in which he said, so you don't believe in the capital asset pricing model anymore? To which my considered response was, I'm glad I know about the capital asset pricing model. It's useful to know about it, just as it's useful to know about the efficient market hypothesis. I don't think if I didn't know about the efficient market hypothesis, I could have been a competent investor. But that doesn't mean I believe the efficient market hypothesis is true in the way that Jensen, interestingly, before he died, Jensen experienced a number of light bulb moments on that and died with a very different view of the world to the one that is described there. But actually, models are useful, but not definitive of the world. The next light bulb moment for me was actually when I came across virtue ethics. And I came across that rather oddly by reading a book called Ethics and Excellence, written, it seems improbable, by a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Texas. I say it's particularly improbable because the person who put virtue ethics back in the mainstream of modern philosophical thought was actually Elizabeth Anscombe, who was sitting 100 yards away from where we are now, writing and thinking about that. But anyway, it was from Texas that I got this kind of thinking. It was put rather more crudely a few years later by another American philosopher who wrote the book If Aristotle Ran General Motors. What would Aristotle is, of course, the original architect of virtue ethics. And I remember being really struck by Aristotle's framing of the issue of what do we mean by a good knife. And what we mean by a good knife is a knife which is good at doing the kind of things we want a knife to do. And the point Aristotle was making, and the point Solomon and others elaborated on, was that there isn't there, that is the sense in which we're talking about a good person or a good business as well. They are good at doing the kind of things we want people or businesses to do. So there is ought distinction, which human others made so much of, is really made redundant by this kind of way of thinking. So that you can't separate what you do from what you are. That was powerfully expressed for me by Bishop Butler a couple of centuries ago, who famously wrote, honesty is the best policy, or honesty may be the best policy, but the man who adopts that policy is not an honest man. And that's an observation which, if you think it through, has a great deal of implications which have not been taken on board in the great greenwashing of which there is so much in business today. Some of you may know the recent story, and to my mind staggering story, of Arkansas teachers and Goldman Sachs. Arkansas teachers was leading a class action against Goldman Sachs, and the basis of the class action was the Goldman Sachs ethics statement. And that ethics statement says, our clients' interests always come first. Arkansas teachers claimed that they had been misled by this statement to thinking that Goldman Sachs was a suitable sort of investment for the savings of Arkansas teachers. What's interesting about the story is the defense to this from Goldman, and indeed a large group of American companies. It is not that the statement is true, accompanied by examples of where they'd relinquished profits in order to put their clients' interests first. The statement was, the defense was, the statement is so obviously not true that no one could reasonably claim to have been misled in their financial decisions by acting on it. It's a very powerful demonstration of the difference between the world we have come to in many aspects of business and the world in which what you do is not separable from the kind of person you are. So that for me, that approach to ethics made me realize that what people in business mostly are doing, as well as should be doing, is trying to build great businesses. And if you build great businesses, profits follow from there. And that's how we ought to think about some of these business. I've made 3 points that changed my way of thinking about things. That businesses were not about profits, but a wider sense of purpose. That the world was full of radical uncertainty. That business operates in a community. And that profits follow from doing well in business. Aristotle is often quoted as having said, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is not an act, but a habit." Aristotle did not actually, I'm afraid, say these things, but an American writer, Will Durant, wrote that as a summary of what Aristotle thought. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. And I don't think there's a better epitaph on which to commemorate Paul and his work than that. Excellence.
And now we move to Tim Besley, known to most of you, but the man who really brought a scaffolding of institutions to economics so that we can focus, as we do in the school, on politics and what politicians do. Tim.
Thank you, Nairi, and it's a real honour to be here, Paul. Paul has a lot to answer for. He interviewed me for admission to university and saw potential in me that I didn't see in myself, and ever since he's been a mentor and a guiding light for me. So, Paul, I owe you a huge amount. We also, Paul is, of course, has been mentioned, the first generation part of the diaspora from Sheffield. I'm the second generation. But the one disappointment with talking to Paul about Sheffield is he never showed any interest in Sheffield football. And my great-grandfather was a Sheffield footballer for both Sheffield Wednesday and Sheffield United, and my mother was brought into the world by the Sheffield Wednesday team doctor, but that never had any traction in conversation with you, Paul. So here's my moment of revenge. I'm going to raise the question, and we talked about Shakira earlier, and I don't even know if Paul knows who Johan Cruyff was, or for that matter, did Johan Cruyff know who Paul was? Is Paul Collier the Johan Cruyff of social science? And for those who don't know, his main contribution was to come up with the idea of total football, the idea being any player should be able to play in any position and play equally well. And this was written up on a football website. It's difficult to overstate just how much of an influence Dutch football legend Johan Cruyff had on the sport. From his time on the pitch, starring for Ajax, Barcelona and the Dutch national side, to his time in management at the same institutions, Cruyff has always been at the cutting edge of football development. So I thought I'd paraphrase this and apply it to Paul Collier. So Paul pioneered what I'll call total social science. It's difficult to overstate just how much of an influence economist legend Paul Collier has had on economics. From his time on the pitch, starring for Oxford, Harvard, and the World Bank, to his time leading the Center for the Study of African Economies, the International Growth Center, and the research department at the same institutions, Collier has always been at the cutting edge of economic development. Okay, so what am I going to attribute to Paul? We normally in economics think that there are two branches of economics, at least when I was first talking economics, normative economics and positive economics. But if you read John Neville Keynes, perhaps the lesser known Keynes, since he was the father of John Maynard Keynes, he wrote a book called The Scope and Method of Political Economy, where he identified a third branch of economics, which he called the art of political economy. And he says as follows: when we pass to problems of taxation or problems that concern the relations of the state with trade and industry, or to the general discussion of communist and socialist systems, it is far from being the case that economic considerations hold the field exclusively. Account must be taken of the ethical, social, and political considerations that lie outside the sphere of political economy regarded as a science. And I think in many ways this encapsulates what Paul has brought throughout his career, not a prisoner to those two conventional branches, but seeing the ways in which economics could be applied with the ethical, social, and political dimensions uppermost. Now I'm going to illustrate the way Paul thinks in a particular context and relate it to the work that I did with Paul on fragile states. There are two sort of key doctrines that I think in sort of both actually from sociology rather than from economics. One I like to call the Weber doctrine, that the state must fundamentally establish a monopoly of violence. And the work we haven't talked about by Paul, and Anke is also here this evening, was the fundamental work bringing the importance of civil conflict as a disruptive force in economic development to everyone's attention. It's hard to exaggerate how little that theme had been in the economic development literature before Paul started his work. And fundamentally, it's about a deep failure of the state to be able to establish order and the monopoly of violence. So that's the Weber doctrine around what it means to establish an effective state. The other doctrine, which also comes from a historical sociologist, Charles Tilley, who's perhaps less well known than Weber, is that fundamentally, to build an effective state, the state must have the capacity to do three things: to tax, to regulate and enforce laws, and to spend the money it raises wisely. And what you see, so in my own work, and it links back, and I'll link it to the Fragile States work in a minute, I've taken this very seriously as a way of thinking about states. Now, one thing you can do is to think about ideal types of states in that world. And we tend to work, this is with work I've done with Torsten Persson, in terms of three ideal types. One group we call the common interest states, which are largely peaceful and have strong state capacities in all dimensions. What we call special interest states, so the Gulf states would be an example of this. They tend to be repressive, but with some limited state capacities. And then weak states, which are the ones Paul and Anke were studying, that are habitually conflictual and have weak state capacities. Now, we kind of derived this from a framework that we worked on for a while, but then we decided to look in the data to see to what extent this was a reasonable characterization. And we used I'm not going to go into the detail, we used a machine learning method, and one was the dimension that Paul and Anke have been emphasizing, political violence. We also look at repression as well as civil conflict. And the other is the capacity of the state to deliver on the things I mentioned and also to raise tax revenue. And rather miraculously, when you look at the data that way, three clusters of states emerge. This is something that you just give to the computer and say, is there clustering? If so, how many clusters? And what do they look like? And you can, it's probably too small for you to see, but you can look for whichever countries are in there. And the common interest states are in green, what we call the special interest states are in blue, and the weak states are in red. Now, what's important, and this was an idea I remember talking to Paul about along the way, is evolved from this a kind of Anna Karenina principle, paraphrasing, if you the opening line of Anna Karenina, that all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And that led to a real unpacking of trying to understand what were the features of the red states versus the blue states versus the green states. And that's become a kind of research project. The one thing that comes out, by the way, is, and when you look at what's going on in the US right now, it's a cause for major concern. The one factor that really stands out among the common interest states is the strength of executive constraints imposed by legal institutions and legislative institutions. They're the strongest correlate by far with whether you're in one of those clusters. And also, just to sort of round it off, if you look at data on subjective well-being across the world, it lines up pretty much from whether you live in one of those states. And that really is bringing us back to Paul's research agenda. I view Paul as trying to think about how do states move around? Can they really develop the wherewithal to move up from one cluster to another, or at least to manage to improve? Now, that leads me to the final thing I want to talk about, which is the work that I did with Paul on fragile states, which was a huge learning experience for me. It's probably after a gap, I've been around Paul on and off for the entire period since that fateful interview in 1980. But where our paths really came together was the Commission on Fragile States that we worked on. And I noticed Adnan Khan is here. He was the, I don't know where he is, but he was the third author on this. And the way Paul kind of described this, I thought was really spot on. That having accepted the proposition, the normative proposition, that living in a fragile state is an enormous source of ill-being, identifying the nature of the syndrome, and Paul came up with that term. You can't think of fragile states as something that just kind of has a simple monocausal structure, but really a syndrome where you have to think of a multiple set of interdependent causal factors. And it defies a simple kind of logic. It's what Gunnar Myrdal called circular causation in his work. So we tried to come up with kind of ideas, and Paul came up with most of these, so I'll attribute it to them, but they came up in discussion. And many of the things that surfaced in the work that I've been doing that I referred to earlier came up big time, such as building a government that's subject to checks and balances and works for common purpose, establishing domestic security, but with the help of international and regional security, capitalizing on pivotal moments. So when can you really make progress? What are those moments? Establishing limited and purposive long-term goals, and in the short term, look for quick wins. This was the art of political economy applied in this context, and Paul was just brilliant in the way he articulated that. So Paul, thank you so much for everything you've done for me, but also for all of us with the clarity of thought and the purpose you bring to everything that you've done.
And now one of our guests who has flown a long way to be with us, we're thrilled to have you here, Michael Sandel, philosopher. Thank you, Michael.
Our panel is called Beyond Economics. That's a misnomer, because what Paul is engaged in is more subversive than that. It's transforming economics from within. It's challenging the idea that economics is an autonomous discipline, a value-neutral science of human behavior and social choice. Paul reminds us that economics, instead, is a branch of moral and political philosophy, as the classical economists conceived it to be. Paul might therefore be described as an economist for the common good, but not for a conception of the common good that conceives it, the common good that is, as maximizing consumer welfare. Paul's work and the discussions we've heard on both panels prompt us to ask the most fundamental question: what is economics for? There is a standard and deeply influential answer to this question that seems so obvious that we rarely think about it. Economics is for the sake of consumption, for maximizing consumer welfare and seeing to the fair distribution of it. It has an illustrious pedigree, this way of conceiving the common good, this way of conceiving economics as being for the sake of consumption. Adam Smith wrote that consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. Keynes, similarly, said that consumption is the sole end and object of all economic activity. If Smith and Keynes are right about this, Paul is wrong, and Paul isn't wrong. So what then is economics for, if not for the sake of consumption? An economy is not only for the sake of maximizing GDP and seeing to its fair distribution. An economy is a system of social recognition and esteem. One of my political heroes, an American political hero, grasped this intuitively. Robert F. Kennedy, running for president in 1968, shortly before he was assassinated, spoke about unemployment in the following way. He said, the pain of unemployment is not simply that the jobless lack an income. It's that they were deprived of the opportunity to contribute to the common good. Quote, unemployment means having nothing to do, which means having nothing to do with the rest of us. To be without work, Kennedy said, to be without use to one's fellow citizens is to be, in truth, the invisible man of whom Ralph Ellison wrote. What Kennedy glimpsed about the discontent of his time is what mainstream economists and politicians and political parties miss about ours. Because they have been offering working class and middle class voters a greater measure of distributive justice. They've been arguing about what constitutes a fair, full access to the fruits of economic growth. But what these voters want, rightly want, is a greater measure of contributive justice. The opportunity to win the social recognition and esteem that goes with producing what others need and value. Now, the emphasis, especially of progressives, on distributive justice rightly offers a counterweight to a single-minded focus on maximizing GDP. It seeks a fair distribution of income and wealth, and that's important. But the focus on maximizing GDP, even if accompanied by fair distribution for those left behind, puts the emphasis on consumption rather than production. It invites us to think of ourselves more as consumers than as producers. And if we consider the globalization project as it unfolded over the past half-century, it sought to maximize economic growth and hence the welfare of consumers with insufficient regard for the effect of outsourcing and immigration and financialization on the well-being of producers. The elites who presided over this project not only failed to address the inequalities it generated, they also failed to appreciate its effect, its corrosive effect, on the dignity of work. So policy proposals to compensate for the inequalities by increasing the purchasing power of working and middle-class families, or to shore up the safety net, will do little to address the anger and resentment that now run deep. And that's because the anger is about the loss of recognition and esteem. Diminished purchasing power certainly matters, but the injury that most animates the resentment and the sense of grievance that has fueled the populist backlash is the resentment of working people to their status as producers. And so only if this diagnosis is plausible, only a political agenda that acknowledges this injury and seeks to renew the dignity of work can speak effectively to the discontent that roils our politics. And such an agenda must attend to contributive as well as distributive justice, because it's in our role as producers, not consumers, that we contribute to the common good and win recognition for doing so. This contrast between consumer and producer identities points to two different ways of conceiving the common good. One way, the familiar way, is aggregating, maximizing individual interests and preferences. We might call that the consumerist conception of the common good. A second conception rejects this consumerist conception of the common good in favor of what might be called the civic conception. According to the civic ideal, the common good is not just about adding up preferences or maximizing consumer welfare. It's about reflecting critically on our preferences, ideally elevating and improving them, so that we can live worthwhile and flourishing lives. And this can't be achieved by economic activity alone. It requires deliberating with our fellow citizens about how to bring about a just and good society, one that cultivates civic virtue and enables us to reason together about the purposes worthy of our political community. Now, there's a reason we shrink from a public discourse that addresses the dignity of work and contributive justice understood in this way. The deep appeal of the market faith and of the consumerist conception of the common good is that they seem to spare us in pluralist societies from messy, contentious debates about the meaning of human flourishing and the good life. If consumer welfare is the goal, then whatever our disparate preferences, more is better than less. Contributive justice, by contrast, is not neutral about human flourishing and the meaning of virtue and the good life, or the best way to live. According to the tradition of contributive justice, we are most fully human when we contribute to the common good and earn the esteem of our fellow citizens for the contributions we make. According to this tradition, the fundamental human need is the need to be needed by those with whom we share a common life. And the dignity of work consists on developing and exercising our abilities to meet such needs. If this is what it means to live a good life, then it's a mistake to outsource our moral judgments about what counts as a valuable contribution to markets. We need to reclaim that question for democratic deliberation. And it's also a mistake to conceive consumption as the sole and an object of economic activity. And so, any serious response to the challenges we face and to the peril that now hovers over many democratic societies is to reimagine public discourse and also economics to attend to these questions: the dignity of work, contributive justice, and reasoned public debate about what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. Thinking through the meaning of work in this way would force us to confront moral and political questions we otherwise evade. But these questions lurk implicitly, unaddressed, beneath the surface of our present discontents. They also lie implicitly right at the heart of economics. That's why everything we've been discussing in these panels does not point beyond economics. It's more subversive. It points to the need to reimagine economics to include attention to these normative questions, including what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good, and what do we owe one another as fellow citizens. These questions, not beyond economics, point instead to what we might call moral and political economy, a more capacious conception of economics, a more explicitly normative conception than the blinkered version that insists that economics must be a value-neutral science of human behavior and social choice. And so, Paul's contribution, Paul's way of doing economics, the example he sets, is more subversive than beyond economics would suggest. More subversive, Paul, but also more humane. And for that, I thank you, and we celebrate you.
It's sort of like an advent calendar of thinking, isn't it? So I'm going to take just a couple of comments from the floor, then turn to Charles Godfrey for closing remarks, and then invite you all to come together for a discussion of this advent calendar of thinking and for drinks outside. So can I take just 3 comments using Charles's example, and Martin Wolf, you're going to kick off. Oh, maybe that microphone works better.
I thought this, sorry. Okay, I thought this afternoon was sensational, unbelievably valuable, and could only be contributed by discussing Paul's work. I've known Paul since 1970. We were next to each other in Nuffield, and we tried to write a paper together, and that is what decided me that I was never going to be an academic. I won't go further. What was wonderful about it, and it's the only last comment, is just how much I disagreed with. And that was very helpful. Many colleagues will be saying. I want to ask Michael at the end, because he raised some fundamental issues. So here are 2 issues that I've been thinking about quite a lot. First, on your contributory justice within society. What do you do if, as a matter of fact, a significant number of people in your society cannot make contributions that other citizens value? Right? And how do you decide what is valued? And the second is much deeper about all this discussion about community always worries me. I can go through the whole reason why. To me, community are the people who are going to kill you, because that's what happened to my family. But that's another, quite different. But the other thing is, okay, take the globalization issue. And I worked on both sides of this and I thought about it. Okay, I accept lots of Americans and others lost jobs, which they liked. And that was obviously very costly. Immeasurably large number of Chinese people and now Indian people enjoyed complete transformation of their lives as on the other side of this ledger. Who counts in deciding what matters? Should we take the view that a completely arbitrary border of the nation state means that the people in it are the only ones who matter? Obviously not. So what do you do about everybody else?
Great. I'm taking 3, and then I'll come back to you. Yeah. Can we have that microphone?
Thank you very much. So my name is Esther Emanuela, and I'm a policy student here at the school. Many thanks to the panelists for the insights shared so far, and congratulations to Paul, who is also my supervisor. So my question is actually based on the thread of conversations that have been going on, and specifically it's on how we can build or how we can grow businesses, local businesses, who would be able to support development and can compete with multinational companies, especially in the context of developing countries. And this is because we are being urged to reimagine economics. So within the context where local businesses and local entrepreneurs are facing stiff competitions from foreign businesses, are having access to are having high cost of capital in operating, what would be a policy to support these kinds of businesses, which is not based on protectionistic policies or values? Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. And last question.
Thank you so much. Andrew Briggs, Professor of Nanomaterials. I've loved this afternoon, and many times we've had talk about the Industrial Revolution, about entrepreneurship, and about production. And for me, one of your characteristics, Paul, is your appetite for transdisciplinary engagement. I think the future of capitalism, with its assertion that economics can be morally load-bearing, was somewhat mischievously described as intellectual trespass. And my question is whether we're in a world that, while it's going to be ever more shaped by science and technology, is it at the same time becoming harder for people to carry in one mind the sort of economic and financial issues that have been talked about today and the science and technology which so often is enabling? And what do we do to help the next generation be better equipped for that?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to treat those questions as questions for us to discuss over drinks, with the one exception. I think there's some appetite for what if some people can't contribute, and how do we distinguish the winners and losers of globalization? Just one sentence, Michael. Only you could do that.
One sentence.
One
all
sentence.
right. Well, my first sentence is, Martin has gone after me with his characteristic insight and elan before, and so I'm bracing for this every time I see Martin. And here's a short answer to each of his 3 points. First, community. I agree, community is dangerous, because once we begin politics of values and contested values, there's the risk of the tyranny of the majority, and dark things follow. I agree. The question is whether that's a reason to abandon or to bracket or to set aside community, or whether it's a reason to be alive to the danger, even as we acknowledge its indispensability to our identities, ideals, and aspirations. As for globalization, I sometimes think we disagree about globalization, except when I read your last book, when you seem to be conflicted in ways that I welcome and approve of. And so my grasp of our disagreements about globalization faded a lot, possibly to the vanishing point when I was reading your critique of globalization in your last book. As for contributive justice, what do we do if there are those who can't contribute what people want and value? Well, one question to ask is, are they valuing and wanting the right kinds of things? And if they're not, maybe we should discuss that and try to change their minds. Think about the pandemic, when those of us with the luxury of working at home and holding meetings on Zoom couldn't help but notice and recognize how deeply we depend on workers we often overlook: warehouse workers, grocery store clerks, home health care providers, child care workers of all kinds. And we applauded them. At the end of the day, the labor market did not capture the value of their contributions. But that just reminded us for a moment that the money people make is not the true measure of their contribution to the common good. It could have been a moment to have a public debate about how to bring their pay and recognition into better alignment with the value of their contributions. We were applauding them at the end of the day. We were putting up banners thanking them. But that moment passed, the pandemic receded, and we slid back into the assumption that the money people make is the measure of their contribution. But the labor market, I suggest, is a very poor measure, and on reflection, considering various jobs and the way they're valued according to the labor market, I think most of us, and I think you, Martin, would agree that the market gets it wrong, and we might get it wrong as democratic citizens also, but I suspect we could do a lot better than the market's verdict.
Thank you, Michael. And I can see, Martin, you're ready to have that discussion with many others in the room. Can you all join me in thanking these four splendid speakers?
So I'm going to be very brief as I stand between you and a drink. I'm director of the Oxford Martin School here. Paul, I want to thank you for all the contributions you've made to the school over the years. I've immensely enjoyed this evening. I've learned so much, both about economics and about you. Paul, we met, I think, 15 years ago, by which time you were sort of well into your eminence grise period. And it was fascinating to learn from Nairi's wonderful encomium that you were a redhead as a youth, which I didn't know. If anyone doubted the huge contributions that you have made to economics, any doubt would have been dispelled this evening. But as I think the only natural scientist, along with Andrew, talking this evening, I just wanted to say how much you have had an influence beyond economics in the wider community. The bottom billion introduced the challenges of development economics to a whole new audience and was a clarion call for change. The Plundered Planet helped my community, provided an economic framework for us to think about both renewable and non-renewable resources. And your position as an academic who engages with the world, both your time at the World Bank, UK government, setting up the Centre here for the Study of African Economics, your work on extractive industry transparency initiative, is just a wonderful role model for a modern academic, both producing research but engaging with the world. And you write like an angel. I mean, the reason why people read your books is they're full of interesting ideas, and they're so well written. You write with compelling passion when you're talking about the injustices visited on the low-income country, or on Sheffield, which you love and which you speak with the authority of lived experience, as we heard this evening. And I'm going to finish by just quoting a passage from your book, and one which I particularly like, and perhaps that's my background as a biologist. And it's from the wonderful title Greed is Dead book, which you wrote with John,
although I'm pretty certain this passage is yours. And it's the parable warning against the dangers of Homo economicus. And you introduce the term catus economicus as amplified by your own cat, Griso. And I quote, "The domestic cat can be not just greedy and selfish, but also lazy. And Griso is all these things. She can enjoy all the benefits of elaborative, cooperative human activity, the perils endured by deep-sea fishermen and the interacting efforts of canners, packers, and supermarket supply chains that fill a can of Felix. No other species has implemented a food chain remotely as complex. Griso inhabits a world of rights without obligations, of having her tin food and eat it, an aristocat. I berate my cat for being worse than Griso and things." Paul, thank you for all your contributions past, and I'm sure in the future to this university, but much more importantly, for striving to make the world a better place. Thank you.